So we're so excited to have Ronnie here with us today. So welcome, Ronnie. It's a joy to be here with you at this special time.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm honored to be here. I'm just going to jump in. I want to say that I'm grateful to be speaking with you on the 250th anniversary of the greatest experiment, arguably, in human history. The mess that the United States finds itself in was described almost 3,000 years ago in Homer's Iliad. The wise old King Nestor addressed the quarreling Greeks in Emily Wilson's excellent translation. Nestor says, "This is appalling. You behave in council like little children. What will happen to all our oaths and pacts, our plans and counsels, right handshakes given as a mark of trust? We bicker endlessly with all these speeches, wasting our time and finding no solutions." End quote. Sounds pretty familiar. So now we ponder our problematic republic, its unrealized high ideals, and its penchant for low-down dealing, a culture of corruption that vows to fight corruption, but is corruption. 250 years of America playing hero and villain, Superman and Lex Luthor, but mostly Lex Luthor. From proclamations of liberty to gaslighting and exploiting of its own citizens and of the world, an empire, pretending to be a democracy for much of our history, especially post-World War II. A country that became a promise of freedom to oppressed people everywhere, but also the model of racism so virulent the Nazis studied it. The place where women, people of color, immigrants of all kinds, and our LGBTQ brethren championed the meaning of liberty beyond the narrow vision of the founding fathers, but also a country that has more than once teetered on the edge of oligarchy and tyranny. How could it be any other way, given our history? Historians estimate an indigenous population of 10 to 15 million existed in America before we got here. By 1900, there were less than 300,000 left. We are no strangers to genocide. That's why it was noble when the United States fought against the Nazis instead of joining them. But is that all there is of America? Was there never a dream? To answer that question, we'll explore the soul of America. What we'll find is that America has a secret spiritual life that's been there all along. Today, America's shadow is not the empire. America is an empire. That's plain for the world to see. Today, America's shadow is the mystic republic, the tantalizing moments of experiencing what America might be, a light to the world. Let's start with the story of Frances Wright. As a little girl in England, she found America in an atlas in her grandfather's library. What she read there so excited her that she had to hurriedly check every geography book her grandfather had to make sure America was still there, this new republic of upstarts in the wilderness. So intense was her curiosity and admiration that she convinced her little sister to join her on a dangerous journey to the New World. Two young women alone crossed the Pacific Ocean, then journeyed across the colonies. The sailors she met on the American ship that brought her to this country that so inspired her reminded her of ancient heroes, she later wrote. They all carried copies of the Constitution in their pockets. They discussed and debated the fine points of this amazing document. Francis traveled across America and found farmers reading the Constitution as they rested in their fields. They loved to talk about America with her. She met frontiersmen with the Constitution in their saddle pockets. She thought this was indeed a new kind of country made by a new kind of human being. Noble people who understood honor and loved freedom. But then she visited the South and witnessed slavery. Her heart was broken. She could not understand how slavery could be allowed at all in America. Frances became America's first famous female public speaker, a friend to General Lafayette. She was encouraged by Thomas Jefferson, who explained to her that in the original version of the Declaration of Independence, he had included in the list of grievances against the King of England slavery, and had explicitly pointed out that slavery was a crime against all humanity. But he had been forced to remove it, predominantly by slaveholding states. She had dealings with President Andrew Jackson, who helped a friend of his swindle her, short-circuiting her plans for a place to teach enslaved people how to survive with freedom, though the only option that was allowed her was to then return them to Africa. Old Hickory, which is what they called Jackson, sold her swampland and doomed the whole enterprise. Later, Frances wrote that the following generation of Americans was coarse. No one cared about the Constitution anymore. All they wanted was money. It disillusioned her that America hadn't preserved that spirit of freedom that could have freed the world. Now, more than ever, we should be reading the Declaration of Independence. We should be reading it to each other. There we find that the grievances listed include, for example, the king's disregard for laws and his obstruction of justice, the very things going on today in the White House. But as we shall see, Frances was far from the last human being to dream of a greater America. And such dreams were often found along the timeline of American esotericism. With that in mind, here is a sampler of key moments in American history that you may never have heard of, and some nominees for the pantheon of keepers of America's soul. For generations, politicians and preachers have told us that America was founded by strictly Christian colonists, but that's not true. Occult interests have always been part of the fabric of America from the earliest days of colonization, even among the Puritans of Boston. In 1979, John Butler, with his article Magic, Astrology, and the Early American Religious Heritage, 1600 to 1760, which appeared in the American Historical Review. Despite this watershed moment in the academic study of what would become known as American Metaphysical Religion, it would take 2 more decades before academia began to earnestly explore what Butler discovered in this essay. He began the article with 2 of the most important paragraphs anyone who wants to understand the spiritual heritage of the United States can read. Quote, "Historians have always treated America's earliest colonies as especially religious people. Contrary to assumptions underlying much of the work in American religious history, American colonists had an ambivalent relationship with Christian congregations. After about 1650, even in New England, only about 1/3 of all adults ever belonged to a church. The rate was lower in the middle and southern colonies. And on the eve of the American Revolution, only about 15% of all of the colonists probably belonged to any church." Butler continued, "Colonists also proved surprisingly ignorant of elemental Christian beliefs and practices. Naturally, clergymen worried when settlers failed to join their own sects of denominations. But even secular observers wondered at the number of settlers who ignored organized religious activity altogether. In 1687, New York Governor Thomas Dongan wrote that settlers there usually expressed no religious sentiment at all, or, when they did, entertained wildly unorthodox religious opinions, end quote. What were these wild opinions that had unsettled the governor? In this talk, we'll examine myths about esoteric influences on America, but also evidence that these influences were more constant and important than scholars suspected. We'll consider the profound influence of Theosophy in Southern California to illustrate how great a force it was in American metaphysical history. Finally, we'll ponder Madame Blavatsky's views on the potential and the pitfalls of these United States. And finally, a few words about this flag behind me. Let's begin with some popular myths about the founding of America that happen to have been promoted by my mentor, Manly Palmer Hall, among others. When I worked at the Philosophical Research Society, I heard about what was called the capping of the pyramid. The pyramid on the dollar bill came from the Great Seal of the United States, which, by the way, was not designed by a Freemason. To the Founding Fathers, it represented the strength and longevity they hoped our country would have. The all-seeing eye that crowns the pyramid symbolizes the watchful gaze of the divine guiding the nation's destiny. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Freemason, had it placed on the reverse of the dollar bill. In conversations I had with Manly Hall, he told me that this all-seeing eye above the pyramid symbolized a truly enlightened country, a lucid nation, if you will, governed not by fear, contempt, and self-interest, but by devotion to justice, unity, and liberty. I was told that ancient Egyptians are reincarnating now to, quote, cap the pyramid, that is, to perfect society. This plan had begun, I was told, in ancient Egypt and was said to have been shepherded through the centuries by secret orders and ascended masters, initiates with supernatural powers. Carefully nurtured through the slow evolution of cultures and governments, it reached fruition in 1776, but much work remains to be done for it to reach its true potential. Mr. Hall presented the monotheist pharaoh Akhenaten as a pioneer of democracy, which he was not. Enthusiasts have argued that Rosicrucians and Freemasons were behind this plan and that their orders existed in various forms all the way back to ancient Egypt. It's a stirring myth of American exceptionalism, but without evidence, it is more likely mythology than history. Among the public Rosicrucian organizations of the modern era, the story is told that Rosicrucians visited California in the 1500s alongside the earliest Spanish explorers visiting Monterey Bay. The evidence? A wooden carving of a cross with a rose on it. But how do we know whether this isn't simply a depiction of the Rose of Sharon, a symbol of Jesus on the cross? That's a more likely source than Rosicrucians traveling among Catholics a century before the Rosicrucian manifestos were written. We can't prove it didn't happen, but we can't prove it did. What we can prove is that Sir Walter Raleigh had several Rosicrucian-influenced men on the board of investors of the Virginia colony, including the treasurer for the project. But we may wish to resist the urge to consider this proof of a hidden order influencing history in a supernatural way. These were men inspired by Rosicrucian ideals, not supernatural adepts. They hoped for a universal reformation. They believed in the value of science for understanding and improving life. They desired a direct divine revelation. They wanted to establish freedom of religion, which the occultist Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II had mandated in Prague, only to have it repealed by his severely Catholic successor. In 1942, the world was at war. The Nazi onslaught seemed unstoppable, and the American armed forces weren't faring well, as they learned on the job. Manly Palmer Hall gave a lecture at Carnegie Hall. The audience was standing room only for his talk about his classic book published 2 years later, The Secret Destiny of America. In that book, he told 2 stories about mysterious persons who influenced the founding of America. My mentor was a master storyteller, so we'll let him set the stage. Quote, "Some years ago, while visiting the Theosophical colony at Ojai, California, A.P. Warrington, esoteric secretary of the society, discussed with me a number of historical curiosities, which led to examination of his rare old volume of early American political speeches of a date earlier than those preserved in the first volumes of the Congressional Record. He made particular mention of a speech by an unknown man at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The particular book was not available at that moment, but Mr. Warrington offered to send me a copy of the speech, and he did, but unfortunately neglected to append the title or the date of the book." End quote. The speech is dramatic, but doesn't ring with the eloquence of historic speeches. Unfortunately, after traveling to India, Secretary Warrington died at Theosophical headquarters. Mr. Hall suspected that the book was somewhere in the libraries of the Theosophical Society. It may still be there. Mr. Hall then refers to Our Flag, or The Evolution of the Stars and Stripes, a book published in 1890. As the story goes, in the fall of 1775, the Colonial Congress appointed Ben Franklin, Thomas Lynch, and Benjamin Harrison to recommend a colonial flag. General Washington was in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. The committee went to him for this historic occasion. The best room in the house in Cambridge where they all stayed belonged to a peculiar old man. He was known as the Professor. Franklin seemed to know him and shared his room. Franklin introduced him to General Washington and the others. Washington seemed to recognize him. Mr. Hall tells us the professor was over 70 years old, yet still in the prime of life. He didn't eat meat, fish, or fowl, or any greens. He drank no alcohol. He ate only cereals, ripe fruit, nuts, honey, and molasses, and he drank only tea. He was a cultured man, well-educated, and studious. He pondered rare books and ancient manuscripts which he deciphered, translated, and rewrote. He kept his work locked in an iron chest and showed it to no one. He believed in democracy. They all shared dinner with their host, the owner of the house, during which the eloquence and wisdom of the professor got the others talking quietly with each other until Franklin stood up and invited the professor to join them for this momentous occasion. The old man agreed, but he suggested that the hostess be included so that the group would number 7 rather than 6, an unlucky number. She accepted and became secretary. In this way, a woman was allowed to participate in the destiny of America. Official participation in American government would be denied to women for another century. Franklin suggested the professor address the committee. He did. He used an astrological analogy to describe the state of affairs. And this is a quote from the book. "The sun of our political air, like the sun in the heavens, is very low in the horizon, just now approaching the winter solstice, which it will reach very soon. But as the sun rises from his grave in Capricorn, mounts toward his resurrection in Aries, and passes onward and upward to his glorious culmination in Cancer, so will our political sun rise and continue to increase in power, in light, and in glory. Professor suggested that the flag be designed in a way that allowed it to be expanded, because this new nation would grow. The result was our stars and stripes. Mr. Hall speculates that the professor may have been an emissary of ancient mystery schools, secret benevolent orders that influenced world events for centuries. He wondered if Washington and Franklin recognized the professor because all three were members. Even today, among esoterics, there is speculation that this mysterious stranger was the ubiquitous Comte de Saint-Germain, who's been seen everywhere from Vienna to Mount Shasta. Him, or a Rosicrucian initiate. Mr. Hall concluded, quote, "It belongs among those shadowy and mysterious happenings which influence or change the course of empire, but will ever find little favor with the prosaic and unimaginative historians," end quote. In other words, there is no evidence that it happened, but then there's no evidence that it didn't. A second popular myth about America that Mr. Hall and others have told concerns another mysterious man who showed up when the founders were getting cold feet about signing the Declaration of Independence due to the inevitable bloody and apparently hopeless revolution that would follow. That stranger also delivered a stirring speech. Here's a little bit of it. Quote, "Look at this strange band of exiles and outcasts, suddenly transformed into a people, a handful of men, weak in arms, but mighty in God-like faith. Nay, look at your recent achievements, your Bunker Hill, your Lexington, and then tell me, if you can, that God has not given America to be free. Let there be light again. Tell my people, the poor and oppressed, to go out from the old world, from oppression and blood, and build my altar in the new," end quote. Of course, this divine proclamation did not work out well for the indigenous people of America. The stranger became even more theatrical. "Yes, as I sank into the gloomy shadows of the grave, with my last faint whisper, I would beg you to sign that parchment for the sake of those millions whose every breath is now hushed in intense expectation as they look up to you for the awful words, 'You are free,'" end quote. He did not add, "except enslaved people and women." The founding fathers hurried to sign. John Hancock got there first. When they turned to express their gratitude to the stranger, he was gone. No one knew his name. Somehow, he had gotten into the locked, guarded room. No one saw him leave. Mr. Hall intimated that the mysterious stranger was a master, akin to Blavatsky's initiates of the White Brotherhood. Future President Ronald Reagan, when he was spokesman for General Electric and host of its General Electric Theater television show, referenced this story in a commencement speech at Eureka College in 1957. No one ever figured out who this mysterious man was, and there's a good reason for that. The story was the invention of a popular American writer of historical fiction, George Lippard. It can be found in his book, Washington and His Generals, or Legends of the Revolution, published in 1847. How did it happen that Mr. Hall spread this tall tale as historical fact? What I heard at PRS was that he received the story in a note from a high-ranking Freemason who didn't explain where it came from, perhaps because he didn't know either. Mr. Hall reported what he thought was a forgotten historical event. Was Lippard a Mason? There is no evidence that he was. If he were, we would expect to find his name in Masonic records. However, he did start a fraternal order called the Brotherhood of the Union. Also, he was a participant in the Odd Fellows, an organization whose members often became Masons and vice versa. And he wrote a book in which he satirized the elitist contempt for Freemasons in literature of his time. But none of that proves he was a Mason. On the other hand, we do have the well-documented story of an important American Rosicrucian, or at least someone deeply influenced by them, a man whose history is crucial to the creation of what would become the state of Connecticut, an all but forgotten founding father who deserves much more attention. His life sheds light on the Pilgrims in a way that disproves the false belief that they were entirely hostile to esoteric ideas. His name was John Winthrop the Younger, and his father was the founder and 12-time governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the man who invented the phrase American presidents love to repeat about the United States being a city on a hill, an example to the world, delivered in his 1630 sermon, A Model of Christian Charity. But he was also the man who helped draft the ironically titled Massachusetts Body of Liberties in 1641, which became the first legal document to officially authorize slavery in North America. For John Winthrop the Younger's funeral, his contemporary American Puritan poet Ben Thompson wrote a poem that has much more to do with alchemy than Puritanism. Quote, "Projections various by fire he made, where nature had her common treasure laid. Some thought the tincture philosophic lay, hatched by the mineral sun in Winthrop's way." Winthrop, when he was young, tried several times to find Rosicrucians. He didn't, or so he says. Winthrop decided to live his life according to Rosicrucian ideals. I think that would have thrilled the author or authors of the Rosicrucian manifestos, that someone had actually understood that the point of the whole thing wasn't the order, it was living up to the ideals. Winthrop first encountered alchemy and the Rosicrucians just after turning 18, when he went to school in London in 1624, just 10 years after the first manifesto was published. The Rosicrucian had already become a stock character in English comedy, a bumbling old man with his nose in a book, stumbling into a hole in the road. Everyone dismissed the manifestos, but Winthrop found inspiration in them. He would later seek Rosicrucians in France and Italy. He would make it to Constantinople and plan to travel to Jerusalem, but rumors of war forced him to turn back without meeting a Rosicrucian. 2 weeks after his son's return to London, Winthrop the Elder became leader of the Puritans, who would colonize New England. Winthrop the Younger helped his father sell off their property in Britain. He also got married and became a father, but still found time for continuing his alchemical experiments. Inspired by John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer and court wizard, who is a root from which many branches of Western esotericism were nourished, Winthrop began collecting books and manuscripts that had belonged to Dee. He adopted Dee's symbol, the Monas Hieroglyphica, as his personal insignia, drawing it next to his signature in alchemical texts and using it to mark barrels that contained alchemical equipment headed for America. Some of the alchemical equipment had actually belonged to Dee. As soon as he arrived in Boston, Winthrop the Younger set up an alchemical laboratory in his father's house. He practiced alchemy and astrology in an elite Puritan household. Occasionally, more conservative members of the community complained, but that did not stop Winthrop's experiments. In 1641, Winthrop met Comenius, who impressed him. Comenius had witnessed hope and disaster when the first Rosicrucian wave crested and fell. the Rosicrucian influenced treasurer of Sir Walter Raleigh's Virginia Colony Committee, had previously worked as an assistant to Comenius. Comenius synthesized the ideas of the Rosicrucians into practical suggestions. First, he wanted to establish education for everyone. Today, it's hard to imagine how radical that idea was in the 17th century, especially the education of all women and of the indigenous tribes of all continents. Second, Comenius proposed that books be compiled that would contain all the information in the world. The condensed essence of all knowledge, as he put it, must be given to everyone. 3 books would be written collaboratively. Pan Sophia, all wisdom, would reveal the metaphysics of the structure of soul and world as designed by deity. Pan Historia, all history, would show how this unfolds in the specific arts and sciences, in crafts and other aspects of life. Pan Dogmatica, all dogma, would collect every theory about human life and activity and analyze whether they are true or false. This could be called an early foreshadowing of AI. Third, a universal language would be created collaboratively. Everyone could keep their own languages, but they would learn a simple common tongue. Comenius believed that would help prevent the misunderstandings that lead to war. Fourth, from all the nations across the globe, the best minds would cooperate for the betterment of the world, to be known as the College of Light, where a new generation of innovators would be educated. While none of these suggestions were ever realized, they did inspire cooperation, faith in science, the creation of the Royal Society, and Winthrop. Winthrop was what back then was called a celestial intelligencer, the intellectual influencers of their time, the most brilliant minds of the Western world. They wrote letters to each other about their experiments and sent one another newly invented scientific instruments like the telescope and the microscope. Inspired by Comenius, Winthrop planned to gather them all in America. But when the indigenous tribes had had enough of the diseases and greed of the colonists, they declared war. Most of the geniuses decided to stay home in Europe. Winthrop lived his life according to Rosicrucian ideals. To protect the innocent, for example. As one of the first governors of Connecticut territory, he fought for years to liberate an enslaved indigenous tribe, and he succeeded. While he was away in London, a witch panic broke out in Connecticut. 8 witchcraft trials were conducted in 8 months. By the time Winthrop returned, 3 women and 1 man had died by hanging. 5 had fled. Winthrop released a woman sentenced to die on the gallows after repeated witch persecutions. In another case, a cunning woman, skilled at healing, who openly boasted of her knowledge of astrology, was accused of witchcraft, including spectral apparitions of herself with a ghostly black dog. Her accusers maimed her animals and vandalized her property. The court ignored Winthrop's appeal on her behalf and convicted her. The lawyer Winthrop chose to conduct her appeal reminded the magistrates that their own favorite doctors, including the esteemed Governor Winthrop, used astrology for healing. To read the stars intelligently and make informed predictions was simply knowledge of nature, like the farmer's ability to predict the seasons. As for the black dog, how did the court know that this was a trick of the devil? It could be a trick of the devil to harm a good woman. The court released the convicted witch, and Winthrop gave her safe passage out of the colony. But the paranoia had not gone away. 30 years later, the Salem witch trials began. Another Rosicrucian ideal was to heal the sick without payment. Winthrop accomplished that too. One of the most respected leaders of the American Puritans of the following generation, Cotton Mather, wrote of Winthrop, Quote, "Wherever he came, the diseased flocked about him as if the healing angel of Bethesda had appeared." End quote. Winthrop invented color-coded packets for his alchemical medicines. To distribute them, he organized a network of female healers he taught to diagnose symptoms. Many of the ingredients he used in medicines would make their way into modern pharmacology. How did Winthrop pay for all this free medicine? Another Rosicrucian ideal was to make gold by alchemy, then use it for the greater good. The Reverend Ezra Stiles, president of Yale College in the late 1700s, described a certain hill in Connecticut as the place to which Governor Winthrop of New London used to resort with his servant, and after spending 3 weeks in the woods of this mountain in roasting ores and assaying metals and casting gold rings, he used to return home to New London with plenty of gold. Hence, this is called the Governor Winthrop's ring to this day. End quote. Ezra Stiles was an early president of Yale College. He met arguably the first teacher of the Kabbalah in America, the Palestinian Raphael Haim Isaac Karagal, a wandering Palestinian Kabbalist who had lived in Constantinople, Caracalla, Hebron, London, England, and Jamaica. It's likely that Stiles and Benjamin Franklin had conversations about the Kabbalah, since they were friends for decades, and Stiles was quite the enthusiast. In 1781, Stiles gave a speech at Yale in which he declared that the Kabbalah should be taught at all the Protestant colleges in the United States. In April 1675, Winthrop, 70 years old, lay dying while New England was in flames as King Philip's War threatened to wipe out the colonies. Even there on his deathbed, he was working on plans to restore, repair, and improve Connecticut. Quote, "The blaze of towns was up like torches light to guide him to his grave," eulogized a Boston poet. A new world was born that would result almost 100 years later in the establishment of the United States of America. Cotton Mather eulogized John Winthrop the Younger as Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes. Whether he was referring to Hermes, the ancient Greek god, or to thrice great Hermes, is not what you'd expect from an upstanding Puritan, according to today's mythology about America's beginnings. But Mather went further than that. He also wrote elsewhere that there was nothing wrong with studying the occult if you were a scholar like him. Common folk should stick to the Bible. New England wasn't the only American frontier where alchemy and astrology were popular. Tom Teakle was a minister to several Virginia parishes for more than 40 years. He had to take on the extra parishes because so many had been abandoned, and the laziness of many of the remaining ministers was proverbial. He arrived in 1652, 5 years before Winthrop became governor of Connecticut. Teakle preached every Sunday and was a popular choice for funerals, but we're interested in him because of his library of 317 books. Teakle's estate inventory included all the Anglican and Puritan writers a well-read Englishman would be expected to know. His library also included many books on personal piety. But the occult section was extensive, well stocked with Rosicrucian books, including John Hayden's The Rosicrucian Infallible Axiomata, or General Rules to Know All Things Past, Present, and to Come. It also included Thomas Vaughan's Magia Adamica, or The Antiquity of Magic and the Descent Thereof from Adam Downwards. The Kabbalah was represented by Reuchlin's venerable classic De Arte Kabbalistica, and Teakle owned a copy of the rogue Jesuit Athanasius Kircher's Magnus Sereti Arte Magnetica, which was a stew of hermetic and alchemical concepts. Estate inventories of other wealthy early Virginians included books on astrology, alchemy, natural magic, palm reading, and Pythagoras. The most popular occult authors of early Virginia were astrologer-physicians, especially Nicholas Culpeper, more famous these days for his The Complete Herbal, which is still considered a standard work of herbalism 300 years later. By 1726, Harvard College was a hotbed of alchemy. A well-stocked alchemical lab was available to students and faculty. This undercurrent of alchemy remained an American preoccupation. 130 years later, Remarks on Alchemy and the Alchemists was published anonymously by Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who became a major general during the American Civil War, who worked with Lincoln. He may have attended one of the seances in the White House Red Room. But that's mere speculation based on common interests. Remarks on Alchemy and the Alchemists argued that many alchemists weren't trying to make gold. They were using a symbolic language to describe a process of spiritual attainment leading to enlightenment. Around the same time as Harvard was into alchemy, around 1728, enslaved and free Africans were gathering in an open field outside New Orleans on Sunday afternoons. Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, would attend these gatherings. It was said that the music of Congo Square made proper Southern women faint. White onlookers and occasional participants changed the event from surreptitious ritual to performance, and from that music would be born rhythm and blues, jazz, rock, hip-hop, electronic dance music, the entire canon of Western pop music, the music that made America cool. Congo Square's ritual Sundays gave us more than American music. It gave us our concept of cool. Scott Ainsley writes in his paper, The Roots of Coolness, Ancient Yoruba Aesthetics in the New World, quote, when the Yoruba recognize these qualities in a person, a work of art, natural beauty, or forces at work in the world, they name it itutu, a beautiful sculpture, an inspired section of drumming or dancing, an act of generosity, kindness under duress, might all be described as itutu, end quote. Ainsley tells us that the Yoruba admired, quote, determined practice and the development of uncanny skill, restraining one's emotions, carrying oneself with a certain quiet, regal bearing, end quote. Cool. The concept of cool invaded the consciousness of the world through jazz music, rock and roll, and the teenage movies of the 1950s, until cool became an American and ultimately a worldwide concern. Corporations spend billions attempting to gain this elusive concept of cool for their products. Cool keeps people awake at night. When we are offended by unethical or aggressive actions, we say, not cool. Speaking of cool, around the time Congo Square was legalized in 1817, one of America's least known but greatest occultists was born. His mother died soon after. He was homeless as a child. Biracial, he was accepted by no community. He grew up impoverished in New York City doing menial labor. He worked, for example, as a boot black. Nevertheless, he taught himself to read and write several languages. As a teen, he took jobs on ships so he could travel. In France, Paschal Beverly Randolph was introduced not only to mesmerism, magic mirrors, and the occult doctrines of Europe, but also the use of hashish in clairvoyance. When he was in his 20s, Randolph was a well-known trance medium. Like many spiritualists of his day, his lectures denounced slavery. In 1853, he helped recruit black soldiers for the Union Army. After emancipation, Randolph lived in New Orleans, where he taught newly freed slaves how to read and write. He took training in medicine and maintained a practice most of his life. He fought for birth control when even mentioning it meant risking arrest. By 1860, he was a respected writer of wild fiction and even wilder nonfiction, books about sex magic, occult mirrors, the plight of women throughout human history, time travel, ESP, and erotic potions. He ran his own independent publishing company. He was Aleister Crowley 50 years before Crowley was born. Randolph founded the first public Rosicrucian order in America. But later he wrote in one of his books that he had only claimed to be a Rosicrucian because people wouldn't listen to the same ideas when he presented them as his own. He was said to have organized secret rituals, including gatherings of black men and wealthy white women, where alcohol flowed freely and hashish provided the incense, at a time when interracial sexual relationships were illegal. Or was that racist propaganda? I kind of hope not. Randolph's complex blend of Kabbalah, spiritualism, and ceremonial ritual foreshadowed many theories and practices of the New Age, and he could be considered the founder of American manifestation magic. He also had the peculiar distinction of being the only black man on Lincoln's funeral train, until he was discovered and dropped off at the next station. When Randolph's work for abolition and then for freed slaves earned him the respect of average Christians in the community, he alienated them by declaring in a lecture that God is electricity, motion, and light, not Jesus. Later in life, he would complain bitterly about his abandonment by the Theosophists, the spiritualists, the abolitionists, and even his Hermetic brethren, often blaming his rejection on his race. Randolph's death, like his life, was full of contradictions. 50 years old, married to a girl not yet 20, father of a newly born son he named Osiris Buddha, who would grow up to be a respected physician. The champion of women's rights and spiritual love had become a depressed alcoholic. Did he shoot himself in the head standing on the sidewalk one morning? The neighbor woman who claimed he came to her house and committed suicide right in front of her wrote that while sober, he was a sweet man, but drunk he was angry, jealous, and grief-stricken. He had been desperate to raise money, offering to sell the rights to all his books, offering to sell his medical practice, deeply bitter that those who had borrowed freely from his work seemed to be flourishing while he was becoming ever more obscure and poor. But others tell the story that he was killed by someone who confessed to the crime on their deathbed. Randolph died in 1875. That was the year that Madame Blavatsky participated in the founding of the Theosophical Society. In that year, a young Southerner named Thomas Johnson exchanged letters with New England transcendentalist Bronson Alcott. Johnson planned to write a book about Plato's mystically inclined Roman devotees, the Neoplatonists. A year later, Johnson visited Plato enthusiast Alexander Wilder in New Jersey during the time when Wilder was working with Madame Blavatsky on Isis Unveiled. Wilder became one of Johnson's most steadfast supporters. But let's back up a bit. Thomas Johnson is why I began studying American metaphysical religion. When I worked for Manly Palmer Hall as his research assistant, we had lunches in the Philosophical Research Society library vault, where he kept a superb collection of rare books and manuscripts of alchemy and Rosicrucianism. During one of those lunches, I saw a large leather tome on a bottom shelf. All it said was, "The Platonist." He noticed me wondering about it and said, "Oh, that's a good one. Why don't you look it over?" What I found inside shocked me. The book bound together 2 years of issues of a newspaper discolored by time. The newspaper that was published near St. Louis, then considered the frontier around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral, was devoted to translations of Plato and the Neoplatonists. Why on earth would something like that exist, I wondered? A newspaper about Plato in the Old West? Mr. Hall didn't know much about it. Several of the names of authors and subjects he had familiarity with, but how this unicorn came to be, he could not tell. My beloved late wife Tamra and I spent years looking for explanations in libraries and then online. We learned that Thomas More Johnson, like so many other spiritual mavericks of the second half of the 1800s, had been a theosophist. We found out that for Emerson and the other New England transcendentalists, Johnson had been the go-to guy for translations and explanations of favorite pagan writers, especially Plato. Johnson was one of the American theosophists who left the society to invent their own approaches to sharing wisdom. Johnson and his colleagues worried that theosophy was becoming so popular in esoteric circles, its Eastern wisdom would replace the West's own wisdom. Thomas Johnson of the Platonist was the head of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor of the West. The Eastern branch was led by Josephine Cable's Aldrich, an extraordinary woman who, with her husband, started a business that was an experiment in putting high principles to work, a company that was very successful while taking exceptionally good care of its employees. She, too, had been a theosophist. The Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was basically a mail order course about Western esotericism, but it had the interesting peculiarity, probably inspired by Randolph, of giving initiates hash pills to be taken only when attempting conception with one's duly and legally married spouse. Joined by the drug at a deep level of their being, the newly christened parents would attract the highest quality soul. Johnson published a newspaper that had no current events, and the only obituaries were of long-dead philosophers. But this wasn't as idiosyncratic as it seems, because in fact, America had fallen for Plato. Americans in small towns, especially school teachers and the better-off local ladies, were hosting Plato clubs with lectures, music, and poetry. As Kathy Gutierrez wrote in her book, Plato's Ghost, quote, "Reports of Plato clubs were serialized in the Atlantic Monthly. Magazines wrote multi-volume accounts titled Plato in History, and the Yale Review kept readers current on new translations. In 1869, the New Englander sported a densely packed 32-page defense of Plato as a proto-monotheist. The Platonist was late to the party in 1881, but still lasted a few years with a small but loyal group of subscribers, including theosophists, New England transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Freemasons, and Prairie Platonists. Eventually, Johnson's constantly frustrated attempts to gain a wider audience included running stories about Eastern wisdom. He was one of the first to publish anything about Sufism in America. The newspaper, with delays and erratic releases, lasted until 1888. That was the year Madame Blavatsky published her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. As the 20th century began, theosophists were not the only ones who flocked to Los Angeles to explore diverse forms of spirituality, but no influence was greater than theirs, especially after Madame Blavatsky predicted that the next evolution of humanity would emerge in California, though she never lived in California and never would. Today, the Theosophical Society exists in 60 countries. Blavatsky and her colleagues achieved this during a time when it was taken for granted that women were mentally inferior to men. Her confident criticism of science and religion, which she considered revered but outdated institutions, must have been all the more shocking for having been penned by a woman. And there were a number of critics who suggested that she could not possibly have written it. But Alexander Wilder, who worked closely with her, said that anyone who had a conversation with Madame Blavatsky would know instantly that she was the author of her own books. To provide context for the importance of theosophy in America, I want to focus on one place, Southern California. From Point Loma to Pasadena, from Hollywood to Ojai, Theosophists nurtured the spiritual side of Southern California. And despite all the bad press, those of us who live in Southern California know that there is a quiet undercurrent of deep spirituality here. During the first quarter of the 20th century, Crotona Hollywood influenced the early film industry, modern dance, experimental architecture, open-air theater, the study of Eastern and comparative religions, paranormal science, the arts, feminism, workers' rights, and vegetarianism. Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant remain well known among Theosophists, so I'm not going to tell you their stories, even though Besant was an important part of Crotona Hollywood. I'll tell you about two other incredible women who happen to be Theosophists with ties to Southern California. In 1896, Catherine Tinsley became president of the Theosophical Society in America. She presided over public meetings at Madison Square Garden. One of her first innovations was the establishment of brotherhood suppers for the poor. American theosophical lodges that could afford it would host free meals in the most impoverished neighborhoods. She then took the idea to England, and on the boat headed there, she held meetings for the first and second class passengers and for the destitute in steerage. In Liverpool, over 300 of what newspapers called the poorest of the poor were fed. Lodges in other big cities in the UK and then Europe began giving brotherhood suppers. In Athens, Tinsley organized food for hundreds of Armenian refugees, then crossed the Mediterranean to Egypt and India to establish famine relief programs. The grand tour continued as this ambassador of Theosophy visited Australia, New Zealand, and Samoa. Her long journey ended in 1897 at Point Loma near San Diego, California. Even as a child, she had dreamed of white buildings in a land of gold beside a sunset sea. Not quite 1,000 people watched her preside over the laying of the cornerstone for the School for the Revival of the Lost Mysteries of Antiquity. Exactly 3 years later, on February 13, 1900, Tinsley officially transferred the Society's international headquarters from New York City to Point Loma. About 300 people lived there then. 25 different nationalities occupied 40 buildings on 300 acres. The community featured Egyptian architectural influences and included a homestead with 90 rooms, which had an opalescent green dome and an amethyst Egyptian gateway. Tinsley and Point Loma were slandered by an LA Times article alleging all sorts of secret immoral activities. Eventually, she won the lawsuit she filed against them and collected a tidy sum. The Point Loma Theosophical community would eventually move to Altadena, where tragically, a fire took much of its collection of letters, books, and arts at the beginning of 2025. On a world tour with another prominent theosophist, Annie Besant, Albert Powell Warrington, the very Warrington that we heard about from Manly Hall, a lawyer and bank director, talked about establishing a theosophical colony based on his idea of a Pythagorean community. He at first chose Jamestown, Virginia, but changed his mind and looked at possible sites in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Mexico. Finally, in December 1911, he bought a large piece of the Hastings Ranch in the hills of Lower Beechwood Canyon near the eventual location of the Hollywood sign. Warrington made local headlines when he announced that the community would be named Crotona, after the colony in southern Italy where Pythagoras taught. Warrington chose Los Angeles because of the climate and because it exemplified, according to him, the fusion of immigrants from around the world. He imagined Los Angeles would become the modern Athens. Also, land was quite cheap after the local tribes had been almost wiped out. Services at Crotona involved a combination of Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist practices and lectures for the public that pondered the after-death experiences of soldiers killed in World War I, a subject on the minds of many. Esperanto, the recently invented, intended universal language, was taught there. The complex of Moorish, Pueblo, Spanish colonial, and other architectural styles was to include a university teaching the arts, philosophy, and sciences, a temple with a capacity of 2,000, which was planned to include 8 chapels named after and dedicated to 8 world religions. But those plans were never realized. By 1915, events did occur, including lectures and concerts. The address was simply North End of Vista del Mar. The cafe at Crotona was an experiment in fair labor practices with limited hours so the workers could always feel fresh as a vegetarian food. Alice Bailey, who was a worker in that cafe before she became a prolific and still well-known esoteric author, really got her mission in life from her experiences at Crotona. Another theosophist, Marie Russick, who had never studied architecture, became the architect of several fanciful buildings at Crotona, including Moorcrest, a mansion where Charlie Chaplin lived, as did Mary Astor with her parents when she was a teenage movie star. In the post-war years, there were summer courses on astrology, folklore, mystic Christianity, myth and symbol, occult chemistry, psychology, and physics. Lectures included Einstein's theory of relativity and a Persian speaker on race relations. In Crotona, during Hollywood's heyday, on any given night under the stars and above the city lights, one might bump into Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova, especially with Rambova's friend, the young esoteric star Manly Palmer Hall, who had arrived age 19 when most of the sidewalks in Los Angeles were still made of wood. Leopold Stokowski was said to have brought Greta Garbo there on dates. You took the streetcar to Primrose to join others in their finest clothes, climbing the glossy black stairs called the Crotona Flight, to emerge into an exotic, spiritual realm where you walked in the sense of blossoming jasmine vines and orange trees, the lights of the small city of Los Angeles laid out like jewels in the darkness of the basin in the distance. Catherine Weatherhill Stevenson, yet another mover and shaker who happened to be a woman of theosophy in Southern California, organized one of LA's first open-air theater events, when the garden at Crotona was converted temporarily into a 1,500-seat wooden amphitheater. Starlight, crickets, and mockingbird song in the canyon added to the enchantment. Her first production was The Light of Asia, an adaptation of a popular poem about the life and teaching of the Buddha, with modern choreography and dancing by Ruth St. Denis, the teacher of the legendary dancer Martha Graham. Stevenson chose a perfect spot for the ultimate amphitheater, but the plan was complicated so she built a smaller one nearby. The first production at that amphitheater was The Life of Jesus, a pilgrimage play, which is still a tradition at what is now called the John Anson Ford Theater. Dane Rudger, who would become a well-known artist and astrologer, composed the music. As for the perfect spot for the ultimate amphitheater, she got that done too, the Hollywood Bowl. But Hollywood became a little too chummy with Crotona. In reaction, first, cigarettes were banned, hoping to deter the nicotine-addicted celebrities. Then, when housing developments quickly replaced the lovely hillside views with ugly rooftops, Crotona moved to Ojai, California, where it still exists. There it became home to Krishnamurti. Manly Hall used to drive up there to visit him. I asked him what the young esoteric superstars talked about. He said, girls and the Dodgers. All right then, we have more than hinted at the importance of esotericism in America, although believe me, we have barely scratched the surface. But what can we say about America's destiny? We'll leave that to Madame Blavatsky. In her 1888 magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky identified the United States as a geographic and cultural melting pot for a new spiritually advanced humanity, that being the natural result of our diverse population and cultural heritage. In America, the esoteric traditions of the ancient East and West would blend with modern science and philosophy. American ideals of liberty and democracy would make this possible. However, Blavatsky warned many times that materialism, greed, and competition could only lead to America's demise. America's destiny was not to be the ultimate world power, but rather an experiment that would inspire spiritual evolution for humanity. What the Rosicrucians called the Universal Reformation would happen in America first. How would it happen? Senator Robert F. Kennedy, in his Day of Affirmation speech in 1966, said, and I quote, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." End quote. That idea could have come right out of a Rosicrucian manifesto. Self-glorification and arrogance, Blavatsky warned us, would not make America great. It would inspire social division and conflicts between races, classes, and religions. Greed would corrupt American spirituality, which would fracture into factions, personality cults, and hunger for prestige. If so, America would fail to attain its purpose as a model of unity. Instead of inspiring, it would disillusion the world with its hypocrisy, while hatred tore it apart. The flag you see behind me is from a cartoon by Benjamin Franklin that promoted unity among the constantly bickering colonies. Join or die, it says. That doesn't mean that you must believe as I do, or else. It doesn't mean that we must all think exactly the same way about everything, and that anyone who doesn't agree deserves death. What that flag means is that if America is to survive, Americans must learn how to compromise. America was meant to be a place where hereditary enemies could become allies, where feuds and grudges could end. We're meant to have each other's backs. Like John F. Kennedy said, Quote, "We're meant to be a partnership, not an empire," end quote. That flag is a celebration of diversity, an invitation to band together to face an enemy we can't face alone. Ben Franklin was asked whether America was to become a monarchy or a republic. He famously answered, "A republic if you can keep it." Every single one of us has a mission in this grand effort to restore the soul of America. Every one of us is connected to divine sources of inspiration. Our unity, creativity, and courage can change our country and the world. How do we begin? Perhaps with this quote from the underappreciated American writer and esotericist Anais Nin. Quote, "The secret of a full life is to live and relate to others as if they might not be there tomorrow, as if you might not be there tomorrow. It eliminates the vice of procrastination, the sin of postponement, failed communications, failed communions. This thought has made me more and more attentive to all encounters, meetings, introductions, which might contain the seed of depth that might be carelessly overlooked. That feeling has become a rarity, and rarer every day, now that we have reached a hastier and more superficial rhythm. Now that we believe we are in touch with a greater amount of people, more countries. This is the illusion which might cheat us of being in touch deeply with the one breathing next to us. This dangerous time when mechanical voices, radios, telephones take the place of human intimacies, and the concept of being in touch with millions brings a greater and greater poverty in intimacy and human vision," end quote. If you would like to find out more about the continuous importance of the esoteric in the history of the United States, I recommend 3 books. Occult America by Mitch Horowitz provides a useful introduction, lacking in recent research since it was published back in 2009, but well worth your time. If you're looking for something more in-depth and detailed, supported by the latest academic research, check out my book, American Metaphysical Religion, which includes many stories like the ones I've told you today. If you would like to read the most important book on the subject in academia, I highly recommend A Republic of Mind and Spirit, A Cultural History of American Metaphysical Religion by Catherine Albanese, published by Oxford University Press. My sincerest gratitude for the honor of addressing the Theosophical Society of America, and specifically the Abraxas Lodge, on this, the 250th anniversary of the United States of America.
Wow, Ronnie, thank you so much. That was amazing, as usual. Thank you. I can't thank you enough. So,
thank you, Nancy.
We have a few questions.
Okay.
If you want to ask your question directly, you can unmute yourself and ask Ronnie yourself, or you can put it in the chat box. I'll start with the first one we got from Arnie. Arnie says, "Greeting from Blavatsky Lodge, Mumbai, on America's 250th anniversary." Thank you, Ronnie, for that amazing information. So, Ronnie, Arnie's question is, why was Blavatsky keen to acquire American citizenship? She left America immediately after being granted it. And Ronnie, if you want to talk to Ronnie directly, you can unmute yourself. So I'll turn it over to you, Ronnie.
Okay. Hello, my friend. Thanks for attending. So, when Blavatsky first came here, she was a reporter, a journalist covering spiritualism. And then when she began to develop theosophy with her various partners, she had tremendous success in America, attracting recruits to this kind of new religion, really, science of religion, if you will. What happened was that there were rumors of disgruntled former members and such who began to report that there was something fishy going on. There were stories that were spread about letters from the invisible masters that would mysteriously appear, and other kind of magic tricks, if you will, that were meant to make people think that there was a supernatural element to her guidance. And there were those who had worked with her who accused her of doing these things in a fraudulent way in order to impress people and to get more money and to get more membership. And it became quite a difficult situation. Those who researched it have suggested that she may have here and there done some things that were questionable. Certainly none of the worst accusations were true, but it got a little too hot for her. And at the same time, in India, she was achieving great recognition, and she was able to function in a way that was even political in a sense, because she was very interested in the independence of India from Great Britain. And so the Theosophical Society took on an importance in India that to her seemed to be more in alignment with her hopes for the future of it. Whereas in America, she found herself embattled by people who were eager to discredit her, and also by former members like Thomas Johnson, who became suspicious of the deep Eastern influence and who wanted to emphasize the West. So that's a short answer to your question.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Anyone else? Raise your hand or unmute yourself.
I am open to unrelated questions.
Here's a sort of an unrelated question, and that is, what started your journey in exploring these occult topics, your personal journey?
Yes, that would be Manly Hall. I saw him give a lecture. He did something that he used to do quite often, which he looked right at me and he delivered a very personal message. I had been living a very dark life. I was somebody who was involved in criminality and violence and nihilism, and I was pretty much a missionary for nihilism. And I had been saved by love when I met my late wife. And I ran into a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages at the great, late and lamented bookstore, the Bodhi Tree, in the used branch. And this was an older copy of it. And I thought, I have to admit that at the time when I first saw it, I thought, ooh, look at this dark tome. It's probably filled with nasty, information for getting the edge on society. But quite to the contrary, as I began to read it, it completely changed my worldview. Beginning with the dedication, which was to the rational soul of the world, which was the most mind-blowing statement I'd ever heard. The idea that there was a rational soul behind the world stunned me. And then there was this tremendous record of these brave people, throughout history who had some of them facing the danger of death because of these studies that they were doing, but yet having such passion for them and for the future that they put them into writing, and they made diagrams, and it was amazing to me that I'd never heard of this. And so when I went to see him, at that time I was suffering from a paranoia that was induced by a friend who had been convinced by the Edgar Cayce readings that California was about to drop off the map. And she wanted me to move with her to Virginia Beach with her and her family. And I was contemplating that. Well, Manly Hall looked straight at me and he said, people who have irrational fears of natural disasters because of the guilt they're feeling about the life they'd been leading, which this just blew my mind. He also looked at my wife, and she had, as she walked up, she had seen this little weed that flowered after it broke through concrete, cracked concrete. And he looked right at her and he said, like a little weed that grows up through cracked concrete and creates a beautiful flower. She was my girlfriend at the time. And so both of us were amazed, both by his incredible 90-minute lecture with no notes, and also by these personal messages. So we decided to volunteer for the Philosophical Research Society just to be around him and to be around these people. They wanted her because she had experience with office skills and such, but really they didn't know what to do with me. But they did ask me if I had any facility with languages, and I explained that I had studied some. I wasn't very good at it, but I had grown up with French and German and Polish and Russian around me, so I had some awareness of language. And to my shock, they called me up the next day and said that Manly Hall wanted to meet me. So I went in there, I met him, and he wanted me to work on his alchemical bibliography. He needed an editor to finish it. And I told him I don't have any skills for this. I don't know the subject. I'm not that well educated. But he was convinced that I was the right choice. And the vice president of the society took the project from me immediately and said that was a mistake. But then they called me back again, and this time he met me and said, you will take orders only from me. And if anybody contradicts what I tell you, you come tell me. And he really impressed upon me, I have confidence in you. And we'll meet every morning, and I'll direct you about what I want you to do that day. We can have lunch in the vault, and you can ask me questions about my collection of books and manuscripts. And then in the afternoon, I will look over your work. Well, who could turn that down? And that was just an amazing invitation. I'm still stunned by it. And it turned out that he was right about me. I was really good at it. So good that he made me his research assistant. And so for 7 years, I had the tremendous honor of being Manly Hall's research assistant. And I became his designated replacement for public lecturing if he was too ill to deliver a lecture. He even sent me to do a couple of funerals that he couldn't make. He was quite advanced in age at that time. And I became his screener. And also my wife, we got married because he and his wife, they picked out dates for us and married us in his backyard. And so he had a tremendous impact on my life. I mean, completely just changed my life. And through him, both of us received this incredible thirst and joy for knowledge. You know, he loved all cultures. He loved to learn. Even at that advanced age, he got such a thrill out of learning something. And that was contagious. And so that started both of us on the path. And even when we went and did other things, we were always kind of doing that in the background. So we used to tour with our band, but it was a great excuse to go to libraries and bookstores all over the country and to search for things that would speak to these subjects that we were so interested in. And ultimately, we were just doing it for ourselves and taking notes and such, but those notes eventually turned into books that we wrote. So that's how it happened.
Ronnie, that's absolutely amazing. We can't thank you enough. We hope you'll come back again and tell us more about Mr. Hall and your experiences with him.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone, for joining